Thomas Warren Wiesenthant was born on January 29, 1947, in Pritchard, Alabama, into a poor and deeply dysfunctional family. His mother was a domineering and controlling woman who kept all family members under pressure. His father, weak-willed and prone to alcohol abuse, had no authority, which created an internal conflict in the boy, between dependence on his mother and hatred for her. Until the age of 7, he slept in the same bed with his mother, and until the age of 16, he shared a bedroom with her. Later, psychologists would call this one of the reasons for his distorted perception of women and emotional immaturity, which became the basis for his subsequent actions. His sister recalled that as a teenager, Thomas became withdrawn, irritable, and suspicious. He often avoided communication and displayed hidden aggression, especially towards his mother. This inner turmoil and sense of humiliation gradually turned into deep psychological trauma, which, according to experts, later manifested itself in the form of violence. The first warning sign came in May 1963, when 16-year-old Thomas became a suspect in the death of an elderly woman who lived nearby. A gun belonging to his family was found near her house, but his mother provided her son with an alibi, and the case was closed. This incident was the first demonstration of his impunity and financial dependence on his mother, who literally protected him from any consequences. 2 years later, Wiesenhunt enlisted in the Air Force, where he soon displayed aggression and instability. In 1965, he attacked a female colleague, beating her unconscious. He was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison, followed by dismissal from the Army. After 10 years in prison, he was released on parole, but this did not change him. Returning to Alabama, Thomas once again fell into destructive habits. In November 1975, he became a suspect in the death of a 28-year-old woman who worked as a saleswoman in a night store. A few months later, in April 1976, another acquaintance of his, a 44-year-old employee of a 24-hour kiosk, was killed. The circumstances were similar. He waited for his victims at work, took them out of town, and attacked them. Psychiatrists later noted that his actions showed signs of a compulsive desire for control and domination, rooted in childhood trauma. His most famous crime took place in the fall of 1976. Cheryl Lynn Payton, a 23-year-old saleswoman, was Thomas's last victim. He forced her into his car and drove her to the woods, where the tragic incident took place. The next day, Wiesenhunt returned to the scene of the crime, which allowed the police to track him down. Witnesses spotted his car nearby, and he was soon arrested. Daniel Lee Ziebart was born on June 17, 1954, in a small town in the southern United States. His early years were marked by instability, poverty, and family conflicts. His parents often quarreled, and from childhood, the boy felt constant tension and emotional coldness. Even then, he showed alarming signs: withdrawal, irritability, and a lack of compassion for those around him. These traits intensified during his teenage years. Ziebart became prone to outbursts of aggression, especially toward women, which later became a common theme in his future crimes. After school, he frequently changed jobs and cities, never staying anywhere for long. He led a nomadic lifestyle, avoided close relationships, and gradually lost control of himself. According to investigators, it was during this period that violence and manipulation became his usual means of self-affirmation. The first confirmed incident occurred in Las Vegas, where Ziebart was convicted of manslaughter. Even then, investigators noted his frightening indifference to what had happened. After his release, he moved to California, where in 1985 he committed new crimes against 2 young women, 28-year-old Gidget Castro and 23-year-old Nessie McElrath. His modus operandi was characterized by cold calculation. He chose vulnerable victims, engaged in brief conversation with them, and then disappeared without a trace. After these events, he left California and headed south, where he would later commit his most famous and horrific crimes. In 1986, Siebert appeared in Alabama, taking a job under the false name of Daniel Spence at the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and Blind in Talladega. Outwardly, he gave the impression of being a polite and well-balanced person, but colleagues recalled that behind this mask lay a strange tension. Among his acquaintances was a student named Sherry Weathers, the mother of 2 young children. When Sherry stopped communicating, the institute's staff sounded the alarm. The police found her apartment, and inside discovered the bodies of the woman herself and her sons, 5-year-old Chad and 4-year-old Joey. The case shocked Alabama. Such a crime seemed unthinkable. The investigation soon revealed that Siebert was linked to other deaths in the county. He was charged with the murders of Linda Jarman, a student at the same institute, and Linda Odom, a waitress with whom he had been in a relationship. Investigators found Siebert's fingerprints on one of the victims' cars and determined that he had used false documents. Soon his name was linked to another case, the disappearance of a woman named Cheryl Evans. The police realized that they were dealing with a man who acted consistently and ruthlessly, feeling neither remorse nor fear. Siebert hid for almost 6 months, moving between states. He was only arrested after he called an old acquaintance, unaware that the man would report him to the authorities. The next day, the police traced the phone booth from which he had made the call and arrested him at his workplace in Tennessee. During questioning, Siebert behaved calmly, even friendly, and confessed not only to these crimes, but also to others committed earlier. He claimed to have killed at least 12 people, although only some of these cases could be officially proven. Investigators called him the man without emotions. He appeared so cold and indifferent during his confessions. In 1987, the court found Daniel Siebert guilty of the murders of Sherry Weathers, her children, and Linda Jarman. He received the death penalty and an additional life sentence for the death of Linda Odom. The court case caused a public outcry. Residents of the state demanded immediate execution of the sentence. Siebert's execution was scheduled for October 2007, but did not take place due to serious illness. He suffered from pancreatic cancer and died of natural causes on April 22, 2008, at Holman Prison. Donald Broadnax was born on January 1, 1961, in Birmingham, Alabama. He grew up in a poor and dysfunctional environment where aggression and fear were the norm. His parents often fought, and Donald grew up to be a quick-tempered and distrustful child. Teachers described him as a withdrawn teenager with an unpredictable temper. He could be quiet, but suddenly fly into a rage. By the age of 16, he already had a reputation as someone who was best not to provoke. It was at this age that he first committed an act that would change his fate forever. In the summer of 1977, a conflict arose between Broadnax and his friend Gregory Manson. According to eyewitness accounts, it all started with a trivial quarrel, but very quickly escalated into open hostility. In a fit of rage, Donald grabbed a gun and opened fire. It was a rash and destructive act. When the police arrived at the scene, Manson was seriously injured. A few days later, Broadnax was arrested, and the court sentenced him to 99 years in prison for manslaughter. In prison, Donald eventually changed his behavior. He became a disciplined and calm inmate. This allowed him to be released on parole in 1986. However, once free, he found himself surrounded by criminal acquaintances again. For a while, he lived with a local gang leader who was involved in illegal activities, and was soon arrested again for violating the terms of his release. Despite this, a few years later, he managed to get another chance at partial freedom. In 1992, he was transferred to the Work Release Center, a special facility where prisoners worked at businesses during the day. Donald got a job as a painter at a factory and seemed like a model worker. His colleagues described him as a reserved and polite man, although behind this outward reserve lay insecurity and fear of returning to his former life. In 1994, Broadnax married a woman named Hector Jana Stamps, whom he met during her visits to the prison. Their relationship seemed sincere, but over time, tension arose between them. Donald increasingly reproached his wife for not doing enough to help him achieve full release. These quarrels gradually turned into resentment and irritation. On April 25, 1994, he went to work as usual. That day, Hector arrived at the factory with her 4-year-old grandson, D'Angelo. She wanted to talk to her husband, but instead of a calm conversation, it all ended in tragedy. According to the investigation, an emotional conflict arose between the spouses, which escalated into violence. After that, Broadnax fled, and soon the child disappeared as well. The police began a search. Within a few hours, investigators found the family's car, inside which they discovered evidence confirming Donald's involvement. He tried to cover up the traces of the crime by hiding his clothes and hitchhiking back to the center where he lived. However, other inmates noticed suspicious items and reported them to the guards. The investigation caused a huge public outcry. Local residents were outraged that a man with such a past was at large. State authorities began reviewing the parole program. Broadnax himself denied guilt, claiming that he had not seen his wife after her visit, but the evidence found and witness testimony completely destroyed his version of events. The trial began in 1997 and lasted several weeks. The prosecution presented compelling evidence showing that Donald's actions were deliberate and intentional. The jury found him guilty on all counts and recommended the death penalty. In September of that year, the court upheld the sentence. Broadnax's lawyers later filed several appeals, citing procedural errors and ineffective defense, but all were rejected. In 2013, the state Supreme Court finally upheld the sentence. Billy Wayne Waldrop was born on February 6, 1952 in Alabama. A man whose life from the very beginning was steeped in chaos, poverty, and a constant struggle for survival. His childhood was spent in a family where fear often replaced discipline and violence became a normal part of life. Even as a young man, Waldrop showed a quick temper and a tendency toward aggression. He had no friends, never stayed in school for long, and soon found himself in a criminal environment. His first brush with the law came in 1972, when 20-year-old Billy was arrested for car theft. This incident marked the beginning of his long journey into the criminal world. A year later, in June 1973, he escaped from a correctional program and soon committed his first murder. His victims were 2 elderly men, relatives who lived near each other. According to the investigation, he broke into their home, tied them up, and inflicted serious injuries. This act of violence shocked Calhoun County. When Waldrop was arrested, he showed remarkable indifference, and his behavior alarmed even experienced investigators. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to a plea bargain and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The court sentenced him to 15 years in prison for each crime, but the sentences were to be served concurrently. In prison, he showed no desire to reform. He suffered from bouts of aggression, declared his intention to commit suicide, and filed numerous complaints about his conditions of detention. Despite this, he was released after less than 7 years. On June 3, 1982, just 1 year after his release, Billy Waldrop was once again the subject of an investigation. Together with 2 accomplices, William Singleton and Henry Mays, he went to the home of 72-year-old Thurman Donahue in Talladega County. According to the investigation, the trio hoped to find a valuable ring and a large sum of cash in the house. Their plan ended in tragedy. The homeowner was killed, and his house was set on fire to cover up the crime. Firefighters who arrived at the scene found the man's body in the burned-out house. Almost immediately, the investigation led to Waldrop. He tried to escape by fleeing to Tennessee and then to California, but was arrested for traffic violations and extradited back to Alabama. During questioning, he confessed to the crime, describing in detail how the robbery was planned and how it ended. On February 18, 1983, a jury found him guilty, and a month later, the judge sentenced him to death. But even in prison, Waldrop continued to demonstrate his cruelty. Shortly after the trial, he attacked another inmate, seriously injuring him. For this, a life sentence was added to his death sentence. Later, it turned out that Waldrop may have been involved in another case, the robbery of a gas station in Mississippi. At that time, another man, Charles Henry Thomas, was convicted of this crime. After Waldrop's confession, the investigation was reopened, and the innocent man was released. This case is a rare example of how even the confession of a serial criminal can bring justice to the victim. The years spent on death row did not make Waldrop any calmer. He filed dozens of appeals, went on hunger strikes, and claimed that he had been coerced into confessing. All appeals were rejected. In January 1997, a date was set for the execution. On January 10th, a few minutes before his execution, Waldrop asked permission to sing the hymn Amazing Grace. His last words were addressed to God. He insisted that he did not shoot his last victim. A few minutes after the electric chair was activated, he was pronounced dead. He was 44 years old. Jack Harrison Trawick was born on February 18, 1947 in Birmingham, Alabama. His family belonged to the middle class, but relations within the home were cold and tense. His father, an immigrant from Egypt, had a harsh temperament, while his mother was overly protective. At school, Jack showed intelligence, but suffered from outbursts of anger and unpredictable behavior. Teachers called him talented, but a difficult teenager. After graduating from high school, he married his childhood friend and tried to live a normal life, but soon his mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. In 1970, doctors diagnosed Trawick with paranoid schizophrenia with signs of aggression. This diagnosis proved to be prophetic. Despite warnings from doctors, he did not receive ongoing treatment, and over the years, his condition only worsened. In the 1970s, Jack repeatedly came to the attention of the police. He was arrested for theft, threats, assault, and once for impersonating a police officer and calling women with false reports of the death of their loved ones. This became his peculiar way of asserting himself, gaining power through the fear of others. He committed his first known crime in 1972. At that time, a 17-year-old girl named Betty Jo disappeared in the small town of Quinton. Trawick later confessed to being involved in her death, explaining that he wanted to see if he could do it. Investigators were unable to find the culprit for many years, and it was only 20 years later that he himself told them what had happened. After that, Trawick disappeared from the investigators' radar for almost 2 decades. He moved frequently, worked odd jobs, lived alone, and avoided socializing. But inside him, according to psychiatrists, a desire to commit violence again was building up as a means of relieving internal tension. In June 1992, he attacked another woman in Birmingham. Her body was later found outside the city. Investigators were unable to identify the perpetrator at the time, and the case remained open. In the fall of that year, on October 9th, Trawick committed another crime, which would later prove decisive. His victim was 21-year-old college student Stephanie Gaw. He noticed her in a shopping mall and began to follow her. When the girl returned home, he approached her, threatening her with a toy gun, and forced her into his car. He then drove her out of town, where the tragedy occurred. The next day, Stephanie's body was found on the side of the road. 3 weeks later, on October 29th, 1992, the police arrested Trawick. During questioning, he was calm and even detailed in his accounts. He confessed not only to Stephanie's murder, but also to other crimes committed in different states. His confession shocked investigators. He spoke of his actions with coldness and even pride, claiming that he had been preparing for them for years. The trial began in 1994. Irrefutable evidence was gathered against him: bloodstains, fingerprints, and his own confessions. The jury found him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. A year later, a second trial was held for another murder. The defense tried to prove insanity, but the court found him fully responsible for his actions and added a life sentence. In prison, Trawick behaved inconsistently. He wrote letters in which he called himself enlightened, but at the same time mocked the victims' relatives. Later, he even tried to publish his writings on the internet, describing his experiences and thoughts about the crimes, which caused public outrage. It was against the backdrop of his case in Alabama that a law was proposed prohibiting criminals from profiting from publications related to their cases. After numerous appeals, the sentence came into force. On June 11, 2009, 17 years after his last crime, Jack Harrison Trawick was executed by lethal injection at Holman Prison. Jeremy Bryan Jones, born on April 12, 1973, in Miami, Oklahoma, was a man whose outward charm concealed a dark, destructive nature. He was called a smiling liar, someone who knew how to charm, inspire trust, and at the same time manipulate those around him. His life became a chain of crimes, lies, and violence that spanned decades and encompassed several southern states of America. From early childhood, Jones showed disturbing character traits. He was quick-tempered, confrontational, and prone to aggression. Teachers said that it was as if two people were fighting inside him, calm and reasonable on the outside and furious on the inside. By the age of 15, he had already started drinking, using illegal substances, and fighting. By the age of 18, he had a string of arrests behind him, ranging from assaults to threats and petty theft. He even attacked his own mother once when she tried to intervene in a fight he was involved in. Gradually, Jones began to live the life of a vagrant. He moved from state to state, changing addresses and acquaintances. His charisma often came to his rescue. People willingly helped him, unaware of who they were dealing with. In 1992, he settled in Kansas with a family he knew, but soon after, a murder took place in that house. A young woman, his friend's wife, was found dead, and all the circumstantial evidence pointed to Jones. There was no direct evidence, and the case remained unsolved. But from that moment on, his name became associated with trouble. Over the next few years, Jones was investigated several times for assault, threats, and possession of illegal substances. His sentences were short, and his escapes were frequent. In 2000, he disappeared completely, taking someone else's documents and starting a new life under the name John Paul Chapman. Under this name, he wandered through the southern states, working as a builder and mechanic, while continuing to abuse drugs. In the fall of 2004, he appeared in the small town of Turnerville, Alabama, where he found work as a carpenter for a local family. It seemed that he had finally found peace, but a few days later, he met his neighbor, Lisa Marie Nichols, a woman who had recently survived a hurricane and was trying to rebuild her home. She seemed kind and trusting, and that trust turned into tragedy. On the night of September 17, 2004, Jones, under the influence of alcohol and drugs, broke into Lisa's house. In the morning, neighbors noticed smoke. There was a fire in the house. The police quickly determined that the cause was arson, and the evidence found pointed to Jones. His fingerprints matched those found at the scene, and the weapon used to fire the shot had been stolen from his employer's home. During questioning, Jones remained calm. At first, he denied everything, then suddenly confessed. But that was not the end of it. In the following weeks, he began to talk about other murders, claiming that he had killed more than 20 people in different states. Among the names he mentioned were girls and women from Georgia, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. However, it soon became clear that most of his confessions were lies. He mixed up facts, named places that did not exist, and some of the crimes simply could not have been committed by him physically. Investigators realized that he was using false confessions to attract attention, change his prison conditions, and generate media interest. Nevertheless, Jones's guilt in the murder of Lisa Nichols was proven beyond a doubt. In October 2005, the Mobile County Court found him guilty. The jury considered the crime to be premeditated and without justification. On December 1st of the same year, the judge sentenced him to death. Since then, Jeremy Jones has remained on death row at Holman Prison. Walter Hill was born on February 7, 1935, in Midway, Alabama. He grew up in a poor African-American family where life was hard and unfair. Education was almost irrelevant. Survival was the top priority. Hill's early years shaped him with a sense of helplessness and rage. He grew up quick-tempered, suspicious, and distrustful. By the age of 17, he was already known to the local police. The teenager often got into fights and arguments. Hill committed his first crime in 1952. Then at the age of 17, he killed a man named Sam Atmore. The quarrel began suddenly and ended tragically. The court found him guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Hill was sent to Atmore Prison, known for its cruelty and harsh conditions. There, he revealed another trait of his character, a desire to escape. After only a few months, he made his first escape attempt, followed by a second attempt with a group of inmates. He was quickly recaptured, but one thing was clear: Walter was not going to accept his fate. In 1961, he was released, but soon found himself behind bars again. A year later, he was arrested for kidnapping and carjacking. Together with an accomplice, he held a man against his will and crossed the state border. The court sentenced Hill to 25 years in prison. In a federal prison in Atlanta, he again committed an act of violence. He killed his cellmate. 5 more years were added to his sentence. By the mid-1970s, Hill had spent more than half his life behind bars. When he was finally granted parole, he was over 40. He returned to Alabama, a man without roots, without a family, and without a future. His quick temper and distrust of people had not disappeared. He often got into fights, especially when he felt someone was humiliating him. On January 7, 1977, this inner aggression erupted into one of the most notorious crimes in Alabama at the time. Hill went to the home of Willie Mae Hammock, the mother of his girlfriend Tony. The woman refused to give her consent to their marriage. An argument broke out between them, and at some point Hill pulled out a gun. Within minutes, 3 people, Willie Mae, her daughter Lois, and her son-in-law John, were dead. The only one left alive was Tony. Hill forced her to run away with him. On the run, they turned to an acquaintance, a man named Robert, asking him to drive them out of town. Robert realized what was happening and, seizing the moment, fled and reported everything to the police. Meanwhile, Hill continued eastward. In Georgia, he met a man named Louis Nunnery, who agreed to give them a ride. Later, Hill resorted to violence again, threatening him with a gun and forcing him to drive through several states. When the car broke down in North Carolina, Louis managed to escape. A few hours later, Hill was arrested. During a search, the police found a weapon that matched the one used to kill the Hammock family. The testimonies of Tony, Robert, and Nunari fully confirmed his guilt. Hill's trial began in October 1977. His defense tried to prove that he acted in the heat of passion, but the jury was unanimous. The murder was premeditated. Hill was sentenced to death. Later, due to procedural violations, the trial was repeated, but the verdict remained the same. He spent almost 17 years on death row. During this time, he repeatedly appealed to the court, claiming that he was ill and could not be executed. All appeals were rejected. On May 2, 1997, the sentence was carried out at Holman Prison in Alabama. Walter Hill was executed in the electric chair. Before his death, he met with his wife and 2 relatives. His last meal consisted of fried chicken and sweet potatoes. He did not say a word, only nodded as he looked toward the witnesses. None of his victims' families were present at the execution. Demetrius Terrence Fraser, a name that has become synonymous with destructive power hidden behind an ordinary exterior. He was born on October 29, 1972 in Michigan, into a family where poverty and loneliness were constant companions. His mother raised the children alone. His father left the family when Demetrius was only a few years old. Growing up in such conditions fostered anger, distrust, and a sense of injustice, emotions that would later define his entire life. From an early age, Fraser was withdrawn and unpredictable. Teachers recalled that the boy often withdrew into himself, but could suddenly snap if he felt pressured. Already as a teenager, he began stealing and running away from home. He spent several years in correctional facilities, where he was unable to adapt. He perceived any restriction as a personal humiliation. By the age of 18, Demetrius had dropped out of school and finally chosen the path that led to a life of crime. On the night of November 27, 1991, his life crossed paths with that of Pauline Starks Brown, a 40-year-old woman from Birmingham, Alabama. Frazier, penniless and under the influence of alcohol, decided to rob her apartment. However, it ended in tragedy. Brown was killed. After the crime, he calmly searched the house and left as if nothing had happened. The investigation then reached a dead end. No fingerprints, no witnesses, only traces of chaos and violence. A few months later, in the spring of 1992, Frazier ended up in Michigan. There, another tragedy occurred. 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick, a teenager from Detroit, was killed. Later, when Frazier was arrested for another crime, he unexpectedly confessed to the girl's murder. And then, as if breaking down an internal barrier, he also told them about the events in Alabama. For investigators, this confession was the key to solving two cases at once. Further investigation revealed that he had committed other attacks, including sexual ones. Psychologists who observed Frazier noted a rare combination of impulsiveness and calculation. He could act cold-bloodedly, but at the same time lose control if he felt power over his victim. According to them, he lived in a world where emotions were replaced by rage. Frazier's trials took place in two states. In 1993, a Michigan court found him guilty of the murder of Crystal Kendrick and sentenced him to 2 life sentences. He later received additional sentences for assault and robbery. 3 years later, in Alabama, a new trial began for the murder of Pauline Brown. The prosecution insisted on the death penalty, pointing to the premeditation and cruelty of the crime. During the hearings, Frazier behaved provocatively. He argued with the judge, shouted accusations at the jury, and even displayed aggression. The prosecutor called him a man for whom remorse is an empty word. The jury found no mitigating circumstances. On August 8, 1996, Judge Mike McCormick sentenced Demetrius Frazier to death. In the years that followed, he continued to file appeals. His lawyers argued that the confessions were obtained under duress and that the methods of execution violated constitutional rights. Frazier tried to challenge lethal injection and later a new method introduced in the state, nitrogen hypoxia, in which the condemned person dies of oxygen deprivation. All his complaints were rejected. After 30 years in prison, his execution was scheduled for February 6, 2025. It was to be the 4th execution in Alabama using nitrogen hypoxia. A few days before the procedure, Frazier's mother publicly appealed to the governor for clemency, but her plea went unanswered. On the evening of the day of the execution, the procedure began at around 6 p.m. According to witnesses, Frazier remained calm. 13 minutes later, his heart stopped. In his final statement, he apologized to the family of Pauline Brown, saying that he realized how one decision could destroy not only someone else's life, but also his own destiny. James Osgood was born in the mid-1960s in rural Alabama, a place where life was measured by hard work, poverty, and a constant struggle for survival. His childhood was uneventful, but from the very beginning, he was introverted and irritable. Teachers said he rarely engaged in conversation, and neighbors remembered him as an unsociable but hardworking guy who always kept to himself. He dropped out of school early, earned a living doing odd jobs, and lived like many around him, from paycheck to paycheck. By the age of 30, Osgood had become a man who had lost hope for anything better. His life consisted of short romances, odd jobs, and petty crimes. Alcohol, outbursts of anger, and lack of control became more and more frequent. By the early 2010s, his life was completely out of control. In October 2010, he and his girlfriend, the cousin of a woman named Tracy Lynn Brown, hatched a plan that would soon shock the entire county of Chilton. The investigation later established that they had spent weeks discussing a punishment plan, an idea that bizarrely intertwined jealousy, resentment, and a desire for power. On October 23, 2010, they put their plan into action. The victim was 44-year-old Tracy Brown, a mother of 3 who was known in the town for her kindness and responsiveness. When she didn't show up for work, her coworkers got worried and called the police. The woman's body was found in her home. The investigation began immediately. Traces at the crime scene led investigators to Osgood and his girlfriend. During the first interrogations, he confessed that they had lured Tracy under the pretext of a meeting, after which a conflict arose that ended in tragedy. Later, experts would call this murder one of the most brutal in the county's history, an act of violence committed with the intent to cause pain, not for profit. The trial began in 2014. The jury heard evidence, witness testimony, and Osgood's own confession. The trial did not last long. It took the jury only 40 minutes to find him guilty on 3 counts: murder, kidnapping, and rape. Prosecutors emphasized that Osgood showed no remorse, and his testimony sounded cold and detached. The court unanimously recommended the death penalty, and the sentence was handed down. However, due to procedural errors, his case was reviewed in 2018. This time, Osgood surprised everyone. He waived his right to a defense, stated that he did not want to prolong the suffering of the victim's family, and directly asked the court to sentence him to death. The judge agreed with the jury's verdict. The second death sentence took effect, and Osgood waived all appeals. He did not ask for clemency, did not appeal to the governor, and did not participate in further proceedings. On February 6, 2025, almost 15 years after the crime, James Osgood was executed by lethal injection at Holman Prison in Alabama. The procedure began at 6:09 p.m. Witnesses said he appeared calm and showed no fear. At 6:35 p.m., doctors pronounced him dead. Jeffrey Todd West was born in 1974 in northern Alabama, into a world where poverty and hard work were an integral part of life. He spent his youth in small towns where people grew up fast and rarely dreamed of anything more. West dropped out of school at 16, worked odd jobs on construction sites and at car washes, constantly changing jobs due to conflicts and outbursts of temper. By the age of 20, he was already addicted to drugs and alcohol. Those who knew him at the time recalled that when sober, he was calm, even shy, but under the influence of substances, he became aggressive and unpredictable. His life slowly spiraled downward until one night became the point of no return. On March 28, 1997, West and his girlfriend found themselves out of money and decided to rob Harold's Chevron gas station in Etowah County. West knew the place. He had once worked there himself. Late in the evening, the couple drove up to the station, hoping to quickly grab some cash and get away. Behind the counter stood Margaret Parrish Berry, a 33-year-old mother of 2 boys who worked the night shift to pay for their education. As the investigation later established, the robbery ended in tragedy. The woman did not resist, but West, fearing that she would recognize him, shot her. The shot proved fatal. After that, he took some cash and fled. The next morning, a regular customer who came in for coffee found Margaret's body. The investigation began immediately. Fingerprints were found at the scene of the crime, and surveillance cameras recorded a familiar pickup truck. A few days later, the police arrested West. He confessed, saying that he had acted in a panic. His girlfriend gave similar testimony, adding that she did not expect him to actually pull the trigger. The trial began in 1998 and did not last long. Prosecutors insisted that it was premeditated murder. He didn't come for the money, he came for power. The defense argued that the crime was the result of addiction and fear. It took the jury only 40 minutes to return a guilty verdict. 10 of the 12 jurors voted for the death penalty, and the judge agreed with their decision. After the sentence was handed down, West did not deny his guilt. Years passed. West sat in Holman Prison, filing appeals, but they were all rejected. Gradually, an internal change took place in him. He stopped arguing, took up self-education, and in 2024 was baptized a Catholic. In letters to his lawyers, he wrote that he was ready to face death, and that for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The most unexpected turn of events was a letter he received from Will Berry, the eldest son of his victim. He was 11 when his mother died. As an adult, he became a father and decided he did not want another death. On October 3rd, 2025, Jeffrey Todd West was executed at Holman Prison. He chose nitrogen hypoxia, a new method in which death occurs from oxygen deprivation. The procedure began at 5:56 p.m. and lasted just over 10 minutes. Jeffrey West's execution was the 6th in Alabama using nitrogen hypoxia and the 3rd in the United States in 2025. A reminder that even decades later, the past still lives on in the hearts of those who survived. Allen Eugene Miller was born in 1964 in a small industrial town in northern Alabama. He grew up in a working-class family, lived a quiet life, was not quick-tempered, and rarely got into conflicts. Neighbors and colleagues described him as quiet, a little strange, but hard-working and prone to solitude. However, beneath his outward calm lay deep anxiety and growing paranoia, which ultimately led to tragedy. By the late 1990s, Miller was working as a truck driver in the Birmingham suburb of Pelham. He led a reclusive lifestyle, lived alone, and according to acquaintances, increasingly talked about how his colleagues at work were gossiping and conspiring against him. The man's mental state was deteriorating, but he did not seek medical help. In August 1999, against a backdrop of paranoia and irritability, an explosion of violence occurred that claimed the lives of 3 people and became one of the most high-profile crimes in Shelby County history. On August 5th, 1999, Allen Miller arrived at work at Ferguson Enterprises. At approximately 7 a.m., he entered the office and opened fire on his colleagues, 32-year-old Lee Holdbrook and 28-year-old Christopher Yancey. Witnesses claimed that Miller acted in cold blood. He shot without saying a word, then calmly left the building and headed to another company where he had previously worked. There, he shot and killed 39-year-old Terry Jarvis, with whom, according to prosecutors, he had previously had conflicts. After that, the criminal left the scene and was detained by the police a few hours later. A gun and ammunition were found in his car. During questioning, Miller stated that he did not remember the details of what had happened, but added that they all laughed at me. The investigation established that the murders were not random. Miller deliberately sought out his victims. The prosecution insisted that the crime was motivated by personal revenge and a conscious desire to deal with people he considered enemies. A forensic psychiatric examination found that although Miller showed signs of mental disorder, he was sane and understood the nature of his actions. The trial took place in 2000. The jury heard dozens of witnesses, including former colleagues of the defendant, who said that Miller had made threats and accused those around him of spying on him. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the defense insisted that the crime was the result of a severe mental breakdown and requested a life sentence, but the prosecution insisted on the death penalty. After a brief deliberation, the jury found Miller guilty of triple murder with aggravating circumstances, and the judge handed down the death penalty. Miller spent nearly 25 years on death row. His execution was repeatedly postponed for various reasons, including medical procedures and legal appeals. In 2022, Alabama attempted to execute him by lethal injection, but the procedure was halted after prison staff were unable to find a vein to administer the drugs. After this incident, Miller petitioned for a change in the method of execution, choosing nitrogen hypoxia, a new method in which the condemned person breathes pure nitrogen instead of oxygen. Over the next few years, the state prepared to use this method, and Miller became the second person in U.S. history to die in this manner. On September 26, 2024, At the William S. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, the sentence was carried out. At 6:38 p.m., Alan Miller was pronounced dead. Doyle Lee Ham was born on February 14, 1957, in northwestern Alabama, into a large and dysfunctional family. He was the 10th of 12 children in a home where violence and crime were commonplace. His father and 6 older brothers had been in and out of prison, and his sister later recalled that their childhood was like a living hell. Ham himself grew up in poverty and neglect, without a proper education. By 5th grade, he could barely read, and by his teens, he had dropped out of school altogether, becoming addicted to alcohol and drugs. He received his first criminal conviction at the age of 20 for participating in a fight that was mistakenly classified as robbery. From then on, Ham's life became a series of crimes and prison terms, where he sank deeper and deeper into addiction and despair. In early 1987, he hit rock bottom, unemployed, homeless, and with a growing addiction. On January 24th of that year, he traveled to Cullman, Alabama, where, according to investigators, he decided to obtain money by criminal means. Late in the evening, he broke into the small Anderson Motel, where night clerk Patrick Cunningham was working behind the front desk. Armed with a pistol stolen earlier in Mississippi, Ham demanded money. During the incident, Cunningham was shot in the temple, and the criminal fled the scene, stealing about $400. The next day, he was arrested in the same county. Ham confessed to the robbery but denied killing the clerk. Despite this, prosecutors built their case around his confession to robbery and circumstantial evidence. Witnesses who initially identified him as the shooter later changed their testimony, but they managed to avoid prosecution by testifying against Ham. In 1987, a jury found him guilty of aggravated murder and sentenced him to death. The defendant's defense was extremely weak. His lawyer spent less than 20 minutes presenting mitigating circumstances and did not mention his mental state, his difficult childhood, or his intellectual disabilities. Ham had been diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome and had an IQ of less than 70, which could have been used as an argument in favor of life imprisonment. The court was not presented with medical data indicating possible brain damage. These errors formed the basis of future appeals, in which lawyers argued that Ham had been deprived of his constitutional right to an effective defense. In subsequent years, Ham repeatedly appealed to the courts, but his complaints were rejected. Particularly telling was a 1999 case in which the judge signed an 89-page document proposed by the prosecution without a single change, simply approving someone else's text as his own decision. This fact was later sharply criticized by federal courts, but the verdict remained in force. In 2014, Doyle Ham's life changed dramatically. Doctors diagnosed him with B-cell lymphoma, a severe form of cancer that affected his skull, lymphatic system, lungs, and abdominal cavity. Later, hepatitis C was added to the list, and the consequences of long-term drug addiction made normal venous access impossible. His condition worsened with each passing year, and by 2017, he was suffering from severe pain and inflammation of the lymph nodes. Despite his serious illness, the Alabama authorities continued to seek the execution of the death sentence. The date of execution was set for February 22, 2018. Human rights activists, doctors, and UN representatives warned that the procedure could turn into an act of cruelty, as the convict's condition made lethal injection virtually impossible. The day before the execution, the U.S. Supreme Court temporarily suspended it, but a few hours later, it lifted the stay. That evening, Ham was taken to the execution chamber. Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. was born on June 20, 1938, in Washington, D.C., but grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, a city that in the mid-20th century became a symbol of the civil rights struggle, and at the same time, the epicenter of racial hatred in the American South. His father, Thomas Blanton Sr., was a well-known racist who openly supported segregation and participated in the activities of local Ku Klux Klan chapters. It was in this atmosphere of hatred and fear that the future criminals' views were formed. Blanton received an incomplete secondary education, leaving school after 10th grade, and from 1956 to 1959 served as an aircraft mechanic in the U.S. Navy. After demobilization, he returned to Alabama, where he lived off odd jobs, distinguished himself by his rude manner and unsociability. By the late 1950s, he was already involved with local radical white supremacist groups. In the early 1960s, he joined the Ku Klux Klan, an organization whose members opposed racial integration, threatened African Americans, and actively resisted the changes brought about by the civil rights movement. One of the darkest episodes of this period was the terrorist attack on the morning of September 15, 1963. On that day, an explosion occurred at a Baptist church on 16th Street in Birmingham, which served as an important center for the local black community and leaders of the equality movement. 4 girls were killed in the tragedy: Denise McNair, 11, Carol Robertson, 14, Cynthia Wesley, 14, and Addie Mae Collins, 14. The explosion shook the country and became a turning point in the civil rights struggle. The FBI quickly determined that members of the local Ku Klux Klan chapter were behind the attack, including Bobby Frank Cherry, Robert Edward Chambin, Herman Frank Cash, and Thomas Blanton. However, according to historians, then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover prohibited the filing of charges, fearing that the state's racially biased courts would not be able to secure a conviction. As a result, the suspects remained free for decades. It was not until the late 1990s, after the declassification of old FBI files, that the investigation was reopened. New evidence, including recordings of Blanton's conversations in which he admitted to participating in the conspiracy, allowed the prosecution to bring charges. In May 2001, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. stood trial. The prosecution was led by federal prosecutor Doug Jones, who would later become a U.S. Senator from Alabama. The trial attracted enormous public attention. Witnesses familiar with Blanton spoke of his racist views and confessions made years after the crime. FBI recordings captured him bragging about his involvement in the terrorist attack, saying that it was time to teach a lesson. On May 1, 2001, the jury found him guilty of 4 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, Blanton showed no remorse and refused to testify. He was sent to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, where he spent nearly 2 decades. In 2016, he applied for parole, but his request was denied, and the next hearing is scheduled for 2021. On June 26, 2020, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. died at the William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility at the age of 82, 6 days after his birthday. The cause of death was not officially disclosed, but was reportedly natural. Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. was born on June 20, 1938, in Washington, D.C., but grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, a city that in the mid-20th century became a symbol of the civil rights struggle, and at the same time, the epicenter of racial hatred in the American South. His father, Thomas Blanton Sr., was a well-known racist who openly supported segregation and participated in the activities of local Ku Klux Klan chapters. It was in this atmosphere of hatred and fear that the future criminals' views were formed. Blanton received an incomplete secondary education, leaving school after 10th grade, and from 1956 to 1959 served as an aircraft mechanic in the U.S. Navy. After demobilization, he returned to Alabama, where he lived off odd jobs, distinguished himself by his rude manner and unsociability. By the late 1950s, he was already involved with local radical white supremacist groups. In the early 1960s, he joined the Ku Klux Klan, an organization whose members opposed racial integration, threatened African Americans, and actively resisted the changes brought about by the civil rights movement. One of the darkest episodes of this period was the terrorist attack on the morning of September 15, 1963. On that day, an explosion occurred at a Baptist church on 16th Street in Birmingham, which served as an important center for the local black community and leaders of the civil rights movement. 4 girls were killed in the tragedy: Denise McNair, 11, Carol Robertson, 14, Cynthia Wesley, 14, and Addie Mae Collins, 14. The explosion shocked the country and became a turning point in the civil rights struggle. The FBI quickly determined that members of the local Ku Klux Klan chapter were behind the attack, including Bobby Frank Cherry, Robert Edward Chambin, Herman Frank Cash, and Thomas Blanton. However, according to historians, then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover prohibited the filing of charges, fearing that the racially biased state court would not be able to secure a conviction. As a result, the suspects remained free for decades. It was not until the late 1990s, after the declassification of old FBI files, that the investigation was reopened. New evidence, including recordings of Blanton's conversations in which he admitted to participating in the conspiracy, allowed the prosecution to bring charges. In May 2001, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. stood trial. The prosecution was led by federal prosecutor Doug Jones, the future U.S. Senator from Alabama. The trial attracted enormous public attention. Witnesses familiar with Blanton spoke of his racist views and confessions made years after the crime. FBI recordings captured him bragging about his involvement in the terrorist attack, saying that it was time to teach a lesson. On May 1, 2001, the jury found him guilty of 4 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, Blanton showed no remorse and refused to testify. He was sent to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, where he spent nearly 2 decades. In 2016, he applied to the parole board, but his request was denied, and the next hearing is scheduled for 2021. On June 26, 2020, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. died at the William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility at the age of 82, 6 days after his birthday. The cause of death was not officially disclosed, but was reported to be natural. Linda Cheryl Lionblock was born on February 8, 1948, in Orlando, Florida, to Francis Stephen Lyon and Beryl Elizabeth Owen. Linda's childhood was not a happy one. Her father died of heart failure when she was 10, and her relationship with her mother was strained. Block later claimed that there was physical and psychological abuse in the family. According to some psychologists, these early experiences shaped her distrust of people and a sense of inner rebellion against any authority. Linda's adult life was ambiguous. At first, she led a fairly ordinary existence. She was involved in charity work, worked as a secretary for the Humane Society of Key West, investigated cases of animal abuse, and participated in the community initiatives. She was described as an intelligent, energetic, and determined woman with strong convictions. However, over time, Block's views became increasingly radical. She became fascinated with the ideas of the anti-government movement, opposing taxes, government structures, and federal interference in the lives of citizens. After divorcing her first husband, veteran Carl Block, their relationship deteriorated sharply. In August 1992, Linda and her new common-law husband, George Sibley, attacked Carl in an attempt to force him to give up his claim to the house. Sibley held the victim at gunpoint while Block stabbed him. Although the man survived, charges were brought against the couple and they faced prison time. Instead of appearing at the hearing, they went into hiding and became fugitives. Block and Sibley published a small magazine called Liberatus, where they promoted the ideas of sovereign citizenship, a movement whose members denied the legitimacy of the U.S. federal and state governments. They destroyed their identity documents, including birth certificates and social security cards. declaring that they no longer recognized themselves as citizens of the United States. On October 4th, 1993, their path crossed with that of Police Sergeant Roger Lamar Motley. That day, the family stopped in the parking lot of a Walmart store in Opelika, Alabama. A passerby noticed that the boy in the car, Linda's 9-year-old son, looked frightened and called a patrol officer. Motley approached the car where Sibley was and asked for his documents. A few moments later, a shootout ensued. According to official reports, Sibley fired first, wounding the police officer. Hearing the shots, Block ran out of the phone booth and joined the shootout. One of her shots hit Sergeant Motley in the chest, and the officer died at the scene. After a short chase, Block and Sibley were arrested. Their son was taken into state custody. At trial, both defendants refused to recognize the court's jurisdiction, stating that Alabama is not a legitimate member of the Union. They rejected the assistance of lawyers, representing themselves as independent citizens. The court found them guilty of aggravated murder and sentenced them to death. Linda Block was placed in the Julia Tutwiler Women's Prison in Wetumpka. She spent nearly 8 years on death row. Her behavior behind bars was calm and disciplined, although she showed no remorse and continued to claim that she had acted in self-defense. On May 10, 2002, at midnight, the death sentence was carried out at the Holman Correctional Facility near Atmore. Block declined to make a final statement and did not order a last meal. At 12:01 a.m., the electric current was turned on, and 9 minutes later, she was pronounced dead. Devin Darnell Moore was born on May 15, 1985, in Coven, Alabama, to Kenneth Moore and Gloria Thompson. He was the youngest son in a large family of 6 children. Devin's childhood was marked by instability and strict discipline. According to relatives, his father was quick-tempered and demanding, and his parenting methods often included physical abuse. His older brothers and sisters later recounted that the boys were forced to work from an early age and were punished for the slightest misdemeanors. These statements formed the basis of Moore's defense in court, but his father denied the allegations and claimed that his son had been aggressive since childhood, carried weapons to school, and had behavioral problems. Despite his difficult childhood, Devin did not stand out among his peers. He was a quiet, reserved, often reclusive teenager who, according to his teachers, never looked dangerous. After his parents' divorce, he moved to Jasper to live with his mother, where he graduated from high school in 2003. By this time, he had already come into conflict with the law. He had been arrested for petty theft and car theft, but this had no serious consequences as he was a minor. Shortly after graduation, he was accepted into the U.S. Air Force and was due to begin service by the end of the summer. But fate had other plans. On the morning of June 7, 2003, Devin Moore was stopped by police officer Arnold Strickland on suspicion of car theft. He was taken to the Fayette Police Department, where 3 officers were on duty: Strickland himself, Corporal James Cramp, and dispatcher Leslie Miller. Moore was charged with receiving stolen property and was being held at the station under guard when he was allowed to call his mother. He spoke calmly during the conversation, assuring her that everything would be resolved. However, at around 5:30 a.m., everything changed. When Strickland removed Moore's handcuffs to take his fingerprints, Moore suddenly attacked him. Grabbing the officer's service pistol, a Glock 40, he shot the officer twice, fatally wounding him. Hearing the shots, Corporal Cramp ran to the scene, but Moore shot him 3 times as well. He then went to the communications room, where he shot dispatcher Leslie Miller 5 times through a glass window. It all happened in a matter of seconds. After the shooting, Devin tried to leave the building, but unexpectedly returned, telling firefighters nearby that something bad had happened. He took Strickland's keys, got into a police car, and fled. A few hours later, at around 9 a.m., he was arrested in the neighboring state of Mississippi. When asked why he did it, he uttered the words that would later become symbolic of the case: "Life is a video game. Everyone has to die sometime." Investigators from the Alabama Bureau of Investigation questioned Moore shortly after his arrest. He did not deny killing the police officers and explained his behavior by saying that he was afraid of prison. According to him, he wanted to intimidate Strickland and force him to handcuff himself, but when the police officer shouted, Moore panicked and opened fire. He also stated that he did not shoot at the firefighters because they did not pose a threat. Investigator Johnny Tubbs, who conducted the interrogation, noted that Devin showed no remorse and only showed emotion when he learned that he would not be accepted into the Army. The 3 victims of the shooting were respected police officers and well-known residents of Fayette. Arnold Strickland, 55, had served in the police force for more than 20 years and was considered one of the most experienced officers. James Crum, 40, was a corporal and father of 2 children. Leslie Miller, 38, worked as a dispatcher and volunteer deputy sheriff. Their deaths came as a shock to the entire town. Devin Moore's trial began in 2005. Defense attorney Jim Standridge attempted to prove that the crime was the result of a mental disorder caused by childhood trauma and addiction to the video game Grand Theft Auto. This line of defense received widespread publicity, and the case became the subject of media discussion. The program 60 Minutes devoted a separate episode to the influence of video games on the minds of teenagers, and the victims' lawyers filed a civil lawsuit against the companies that produced the game. However, the prosecution argued that Devin acted in cold blood and with full awareness. Prosecutors pointed out that he knew exactly how to handle a gun and was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Medical examinations found no signs of psychosis, and his behavior during his escape, returning for his shoe, carjacking, attempting to flee, indicated a clear awareness of his actions. In August 2005, a jury found Devin Moore guilty of 3 counts of aggravated murder. The judge sentenced him to death by lethal injection. The sentence was upheld by the Alabama Court of Appeals in 2012. The Devin Moore case became a precedent for discussing the influence of violence in popular culture on teenagers. It sparked a fierce debate between supporters of censorship and defenders of freedom of expression. Although the court did not recognize video games as the direct cause of the tragedy, this version became firmly established in the public consciousness for a long time.